Imagine a morning where the American flag still flies over Washington, the dollar still trades, and the world still calls the United States a superpower. But Texas is no longer part of it. No gunfire, no revolution in the streets, just a declaration, signed, announced, and broadcast across the globe. Texas has chosen to become a country. At first, the world reacts with disbelief. Commentators argue whether it's even legal. Social media turns it into comedy. News panels call it political theater. But beneath the noise, something far more serious begins to move. Markets slow. Diplomats pause. Military analysts stop smiling. Because Texas isn't just another state. Texas is a system. Texas was once its own republic. That fact is often treated like trivia, but history has weight. For nearly a decade, Texas existed as a sovereign nation with its own army, diplomacy, and borders. The idea of independence is not foreign to its identity, it is buried deep inside it. So when Texas declares independence again, it doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like something unfinished being resumed. Texas alone has an economy larger than most countries on Earth. If Texas were independent, it would rank among the top 10 global economies. It produces energy that powers continents. Oil, gas, wind. Texas is not dependent, it is a supplier. The United States doesn't just lose land if Texas leaves, it loses leverage. Energy markets react immediately. Oil prices don't explode, they hesitate. And hesitation is worse. It signals uncertainty. Then comes trade. Texas shares one of the most active borders on the planet with Mexico. Goods, labor, money, and culture move through it constantly. As a country, Texas would instantly control one of the most strategic trade corridors in the Western Hemisphere. New tariffs, new rules, new power. The U.S. supply chain, optimized for internal unity, would fracture overnight. The dollar would feel pressure again, not collapse, but strain. Texas is deeply embedded in American financial systems. Removing it is like pulling an organ from a body that still lives but must now learn balance. Investors wouldn't ask whether America survives, they would ask whether America is predictable anymore. And then the military question rises, heavy and unavoidable. Texas hosts some of the largest U.S. military bases in the world: Fort Cavazos, Lackland, Shepherd, strategic air power, training centers, logistics hubs. These bases are not decorative, they are critical. If Texas becomes a country, do these bases remain American islands inside a foreign nation? Are they withdrawn? Are they negotiated? Or does Texas inherit military infrastructure designed for a global empire? The answer matters to every nation watching. NATO would quietly reassess. China would observe patterns. Russia would probe boundaries. Power vacuums don't stay empty, they invite pressure. Inside the remaining United States, the reaction would not be explosive. It would be existential. If Texas can leave, what does the Union actually mean? The Constitution suddenly feels less eternal. Federal authority looks negotiable. Other states wouldn't rush to secede, but they would begin to imagine it, and imagination is dangerous. For Texas itself, independence would be brutal before it is beautiful. Nationhood is expensive. Borders require enforcement. Defense requires funding. Diplomacy requires compromise. Texas would need embassies, treaties, intelligence, and international credibility. It would need to decide whether to create its own currency or continue using the US dollar. A new currency would take years to earn trust. Using the dollar would mean dependence on a nation it just left. Immigration would become a crisis overnight. Millions cross Texas borders legally and illegally each year. As a country, Texas would face choices no state ever had to make alone. Enforcement would strain society. Labor markets would shake. Agriculture, construction, energy, all deeply tied to migrant labor, would feel immediate shock. Socially, the world would turn Texas into a symbol. Supporters would call it bold. Critics would call it reckless. Every success would be exaggerated as proof of independence. Every failure would be broadcast as warning. Texas would not be allowed to simply exist, it would be tested. Culturally, the shift would be profound. Texans already possess a strong identity. As a nation, that identity would harden. Flags would mean more. Borders would feel real. Patriotism would intensify, but so would division. Not everyone would agree with independence. Some would feel abandoned, others liberated. Meanwhile, the United States would lose more than land and money. It would lose narrative control. The story of a permanent union would be broken. Allies would quietly ask whether American commitments are eternal. Enemies would quietly test responses. Every negotiation would carry doubt, not loud, but present. Globally, something deeper would change. Texas becoming a country wouldn't start wars, it would start thoughts. Scotland, Catalonia, Quebec, Kurdistan, Taiwan, regions around the world would study Texas not as rebellion but as precedent. The idea that borders are permanent would weaken. In the long run, Texas might survive, it might even thrive, or it might struggle under the weight of sovereignty. But the real impact wouldn't be measured in GDP or flags, it would be measured in belief. Because once a system proves it can fracture peacefully, no system ever feels unbreakable again. Texas becoming a country wouldn't end the United States, but it would end the version of the United States the world trusted without question. And from that moment on, power everywhere would feel temporary. But the story does not end with declarations, borders, or flags. That is only the surface. The real consequences of Texas becoming a country would not appear on day one or even in the first year. They would unfold, slowly, quietly, in places most people never look, in contracts, alliances, doctrines, and assumptions that once held the world together. Within months, Washington would begin to feel something unfamiliar: strategic isolation. Not total, not dramatic, but noticeable. With Texas gone, America's geographic depth shrinks. Its southern buffer changes character. Its ability to project power across two oceans becomes more complex, more expensive, more conditional. Military planners would redraw maps late into the night, not because war is coming, but because certainty is leaving. At the same time, Texas would be learning the hardest lesson of sovereignty, that independence does not mean control, it means responsibility. Every flood, every hurricane, every infrastructure failure would now be a national crisis with no federal safety net. The cost of disaster response alone would test the new nation's finances. Insurance markets would reprice risk overnight. Investors would demand higher returns. Borrowing would become expensive. Freedom always comes with interest. Diplomacy would become Texas's daily battlefield. Mexico would not see Texas as a former state, but as a new neighbor, and neighbors renegotiate everything: border agreements, water rights, security cooperation. Central American migration flows would no longer be America's problem alone. Texas would stand at the front line of a humanitarian and political challenge that once belonged to a superpower. Then comes international recognition. Some countries would recognize Texas immediately, eager to establish trade and influence. Others would wait, watching how Washington reacts. A few would refuse outright, not out of hostility toward Texas, but fear of encouraging separatism within their own borders. Recognition would become currency. Texas would learn quickly that legitimacy is negotiated, not declared. Inside Texas, the emotional high of independence would begin to fade, replaced by hard questions. Taxes would rise. They always do. Defense budgets would demand sacrifice. Universal health care, education, infrastructure, every promise would collide with arithmetic. Political unity would fracture into parties arguing over what kind of country Texas is supposed to be: conservative, libertarian, nationalist, corporate. The battle over identity would be louder than the battle for independence ever was. Meanwhile, the remaining United States would be forced to redefine itself. Without Texas, America would still be powerful, but power would feel heavier, more fragile. Federal authority would tighten, not loosen. Washington would work to prevent further fragmentation, strengthening laws, messaging, and control. The idea of secession would become taboo again, not because it failed, but because it succeeded once. Globally, intelligence agencies would update their doctrines. Analysts would note a dangerous trend. Great powers no longer fall through war alone, they dissolve through choice. Influence would shift from brute force to psychological leverage. Narratives would become weapons. Belief would become strategy. And that is where the most dangerous effect appears. If Texas can leave peacefully, why can't others? Scotland would reopen debates. Catalonia would push harder. Regions across Africa, Asia, and Europe would study the Texas model carefully, not with anger, but with patience, waiting, watching, learning how a system breaks without violence. International law would struggle to keep up. Borders drawn decades ago would feel outdated. Treaties written for permanent states would feel temporary. The world order, built after World War II on stability and fixed alliances, would begin to feel old. Technology would accelerate this shift. Digital economies care less about geography. Corporations would treat Texas not as a country, but as a market. Loyalty would belong to profit, not flags. Governments would compete not for territory, but for relevance. Years later, children in Texas would grow up pledging allegiance to a flag that didn't exist a decade earlier. Children in the United States would learn a different map, a thinner one. Neither would feel dramatic, it would feel normal. And that is how history truly changes, not with explosions, but with normalization. Looking back, historians would argue endlessly. Some would say Texas proved that peaceful separation is possible. Others would say it weakened the world. Some would call it liberation, others fragmentation. But all would agree on one thing. The moment Texas became a country, the idea of permanence died. Empires would no longer feel eternal. Unions would no longer feel sacred. Power would feel conditional, rented, temporary. And somewhere in the background, a quiet truth would settle into global consciousness. If borders can move without war, then nothing is fixed anymore. Not nations, not alliances, not power. Texas becoming a country would not be remembered as a single event. It would be remembered as the moment the modern world realized it was living on borrowed stability.